I think there's been a small change to the seating chart. The wedding coordinator said it quietly, like she was trying not to attract attention. She leaned slightly toward me, her voice careful, almost apologetic. Your sister asked if you could move to a different table. For a second, I thought she meant just temporarily. Maybe someone elderly needed a closer seat. Maybe a chair had broken. Weddings always had little last-minute adjustments. Sure, I said automatically. Where should I go? She pointed toward the far side of the ballroom, all the way in the back. I followed her gaze. The reception hall at the Lakeshore Hotel was bright and loud with that soft kind of celebration noise, silverware clinking, glasses touching, people laughing in bursts. At the front of the room were the long tables reserved for immediate family and the wedding party. My parents were seated at the table closest to the bride and groom. My sister Emily was already walking between guests, smiling the way brides do when they're trying to greet everyone at once. But the table with my name on it now sat near the back wall, almost beside the service door where waiters carried trays in and out. I blinked once, thinking maybe I had misheard. Sorry, I said gently. I was supposed to be at table 3. Yes, the coordinator replied. There was a change. I glanced again at the front tables. Table 3 was right beside my parents'. Now someone else's name card was sitting in my spot. Did Emily ask for this? I asked. The coordinator hesitated just long enough for me to understand the answer. Yes. Then she gave a small, polite smile. It's just a seating adjustment. I nodded slowly, even though something inside my chest had started tightening. Around us, guests were still finding their seats. Nobody seemed to be paying attention to the quiet little rearrangement happening in the corner. Still, I felt strangely exposed standing there with my name card in my hand. Of course, I said. No problem. I walked across the room. The back table held 8 chairs. 2 were already occupied by an older couple I didn't recognize. Another seat had been taken by a distant cousin from my dad's side. No one at the table seemed to know why I was there either. One woman glanced toward the front of the room and then back at me. Aren't you the bride's sister? She asked. I smiled politely. Yes. She looked confused but didn't say anything else. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap, trying to ignore the small knot forming in my stomach. Across the room, Emily was laughing with a group of guests near the dance floor. For a moment, our eyes almost met. Then she turned away. The band started playing a soft jazz version of something familiar, and the reception officially began. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Weddings were chaotic. Seating plans changed all the time. Maybe someone important had arrived last minute. Maybe the groom's family needed more space. There had to be a simple explanation. Still, as the servers began bringing out the first round of drinks, I noticed something that made the tight feeling in my chest grow heavier. Everyone seated near the front tables seemed to belong there. Emily's college friends, her new in-laws, a handful of people in tailored suits who looked like they had stepped out of some corporate conference. People who knew exactly where they were supposed to sit. Meanwhile, I was sitting beside strangers at the back of the room during my own sister's wedding reception. It was a strange place to realize something might be wrong. I'm the middle child in my family. Emily is 3 years younger than me. Our older brother lives across the country now and rarely makes it home for big family events, which meant that growing up, a lot of responsibilities quietly shifted toward me. Not in a dramatic way, just in small, everyday ways that slowly became normal. If something needed organizing, I handled it. If our parents were overwhelmed during holidays, I helped manage things. If plans started falling apart, I stepped in. It never felt like a burden. It just felt like my place in the family. Emily had always been different. She was the kind of person who naturally drew attention without trying. Teachers loved her. Friends gathered around her. When she walked into a room, conversations shifted toward her almost automatically. Our mom used to say Emily had a light about her. I don't think she meant anything bad by it. But over time, I started noticing that Emily's light seemed to make the rest of us stand slightly outside its circle. Even so, I loved my sister. And when she got engaged a year earlier, I genuinely wanted her wedding to be perfect. That's why I ended up helping with so much of it. The original plan had been simple. Emily and her fiancé, Daniel, wanted a large summer wedding near the lake where our family used to vacation. At first, everything seemed easy, but about 3 months before the ceremony, things started unraveling. The first problem was the venue. A scheduling conflict forced them to move the entire reception from the original location to the Lakeshore Hotel with less than 8 weeks' notice. Emily panicked. Daniel worked long hours and wasn't particularly interested in wedding logistics. Our mom tried to help, but quickly became overwhelmed by the details. So I stepped in. I spent 2 weeks coordinating with vendors, calling florists, rearranging catering contracts, helping redesign the seating layout to fit the new ballroom. Emily cried on the phone with me more than once during that period. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she told me one night around midnight while we were reviewing table arrangements over video chat. "You're basically saving this entire wedding." I laughed it off. That's what sisters are for. At the time, I meant it. Now, sitting at the back of the reception hall, those late nights felt strangely distant. The first course arrived: salmon with roasted vegetables. As plates were placed in front of guests, the room filled with the soft hum of conversation. I noticed something else then. During weddings, there's usually a natural gravity to family tables. People stop by, conversations overlap, relatives drift between seats. But at my table, nobody stopped. Everyone moved toward the front, toward Emily, toward the people who seemed to matter. Halfway through dinner, Emily finally approached our table. She was holding her champagne glass and smiling politely at everyone. "Oh, good," she said when she saw me. "You found your seat." Her voice sounded cheerful, but there was something slightly tight around the edges. "Yeah," I replied. For a moment, I waited for her to explain. She didn't. Instead, she looked briefly toward the front tables. "Everything okay back here?" "Yes," I said. Then I added quietly, "I thought I was supposed to be at table 3. Emily exhaled softly. "It was just easier to move things around," she said. "Daniel's parents needed a few extra seats for some business friends." I blinked. "So my seat disappeared?" "It's just seating," she said quickly. "Please don't make today complicated." Her tone wasn't angry, but it carried a kind of quiet warning. Around us, the people at the table had stopped talking. Emily noticed and lowered her voice. "It's just one evening," she added. Then she squeezed my shoulder lightly. "I'll talk to you later." And just like that, she walked away. I sat there for a long moment staring down at my plate. Across the room, applause suddenly broke out as the best man stood up to begin his speech. The lights dimmed slightly. People turned their chairs toward the dance floor. From the back of the room, I watched my sister laugh beside her new husband while the speech began. The best man talked about Daniel's childhood, about their college years, about how Daniel had met the most incredible woman. Everyone laughed in the right places. Everyone clapped at the end. Then Emily's maid of honor stood up. She told stories about their friendship, about late-night phone calls, about how Emily had always been the kind of person who brought people together. More laughter, more applause. I noticed something slowly while the speeches continued. No one mentioned the months of planning. No one mentioned the chaos that had nearly canceled the wedding when the venue changed. No one mentioned the person who had spent evenings reorganizing everything so the event could still happen. I wasn't expecting a speech, but the silence felt oddly familiar, like a pattern I had seen before but never fully recognized. By the time dessert arrived, the band had started playing upbeat music and guests were gathering near the dance floor. Emily and Daniel shared their first dance. From the back table, the moment looked almost like a scene on television. Beautiful, perfectly framed, and strangely far away. I tried to push the uneasy feeling aside. Maybe I was overthinking everything. Maybe Emily really had just needed extra seats. Still, as I sat there watching the celebration unfold from the edge of the room, a quiet thought kept circling my mind. Not angry, not dramatic, just quietly persistent. If moving me to the back had been such a simple decision, why had no one thought it was worth mentioning beforehand? The strange thing about moments like that is how quiet they can be. Nothing dramatic happened after Emily walked away from the table. The band kept playing, people started dancing. A few guests drifted outside to the terrace overlooking the lake. The wedding reception moved forward exactly the way receptions always do. But the feeling inside me had shifted in a way I couldn't quite name yet. It wasn't anger, at least not immediately. It was more like the slow awareness that I had just seen something clearly for the first time. From the back of the ballroom, the entire evening looked slightly different. I watched relatives walk up to the front tables to congratulate my parents. I watched Emily's new in-laws introduce themselves to people who looked like business partners or clients. Several of the men in those suits had the kind of careful, polished conversations people have when they're trying to build professional relationships, even at social events. At one point, Daniel leaned over and pointed toward a group seated near my parents. Emily nodded and smiled in that attentive way she had when she was trying to impress someone. For the first time that evening, the explanation she'd given me started to make more sense. Daniel's parents needed extra seats, business friends, important connections. I glanced again at the front tables. Those seats weren't just about family. They were about appearances. And apparently, my place in that picture had been negotiable. I stayed at the reception for another hour, long enough to watch the cake cutting, long enough to dance once with my cousin Mark when he wandered over from the bar and asked why I was sitting so far away from everyone else. "Logistics," I told him lightly. He raised an eyebrow but didn't push. Eventually, the evening began to wind down. Guests started gathering their coats, and the staff began clearing glasses from the tables. Emily and Daniel stood near the exit, hugging people goodbye. When it was my turn, Emily wrapped her arms around me briefly. "Thank you again for everything you did," she said. Her voice sounded sincere, but the words floated oddly in the air between us. "You're welcome," I replied. For a second, I thought about mentioning the seating again, but the moment didn't feel right. The lobby was full of guests waiting for rides. People were still celebrating. Emily's makeup was smudged slightly from hours of smiling, so I just squeezed her hand and stepped aside for the next person in line. That night, I drove home alone. The highway was mostly empty, the way it often is after big events, when everyone else is still gathered somewhere celebrating. I kept replaying the conversation in my head. "It's just seating. Please don't make today complicated." The words themselves weren't cruel, but the tone had been unmistakable. What stayed with me most was the certainty in Emily's voice, like the decision had already been made long before the moment I discovered it. For the first couple of days after the wedding, I tried not to think about it too much. People get caught up in weddings. Families make strange choices when they're under pressure. Maybe the seating really had just been about Daniel's parents and their business guests. Still, small details from the evening kept returning to me, like the way the wedding coordinator had hesitated before answering my question, or the way my parents never acknowledged that I was sitting across the room, or how quickly Emily had shut down the conversation. 3 days later, I met my cousin Rachel for coffee. Rachel had been at the reception, though we hadn't spoken much that night. She slid into the booth across from me with a tired smile. "Still recovering from wedding weekend?" she asked. "Something like that." We chatted for a few minutes about normal things, work, travel plans, how nice the ceremony had been by the lake. Then Rachel stirred her coffee slowly. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure. Why were you sitting at the back table?" I shrugged. "Seating change." Rachel looked skeptical. "That wasn't last minute." "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "Well, I helped Emily stuff some of the welcome envelopes the week before the wedding." I felt a quiet shift in my chest. "Okay." "And the seating chart was already printed." I blinked. "What?" Rachel nodded. "I remember because Emily was stressing about the table layout. She kept rearranging the front tables." The cafe around us suddenly felt very loud. "You're sure?" I asked. "Yeah," Rachel said carefully. "Why?" I stared down at my coffee. The printed seating chart I'd seen at the reception had looked polished and final, not something someone had rushed together minutes before dinner. "So they planned it," I said quietly. Rachel frowned. "You didn't know?" I shook my head. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Rachel leaned back slightly. "Honestly, I thought you agreed to it." "No." Another silence settled between us. It wasn't a dramatic moment, but it was the first time the explanation I'd been telling myself started to fall apart. If the seating chart had been finalized a week earlier, then someone had looked at the layout of that ballroom and deliberately moved my name to the back table. Someone had decided that was the best place for me to sit, and nobody had mentioned it. I went home after coffee and sat in my apartment for a long time without turning on the lights. The late afternoon sun was coming through the windows in long strips across the floor. I thought about the past year of wedding planning, about the dozens of phone calls, the vendor contracts, the seating layout spreadsheets Emily and I had worked on together. I had literally helped design that ballroom arrangement. At some point during that process, my name had quietly disappeared from the family table, and I hadn't even noticed. That realization felt heavier than the seating itself. A week later, my mother called. "Your Aunt Linda's anniversary dinner is next month," she said. Her voice carried the casual tone she used when assigning family logistics. "We'll probably need someone to coordinate the reservations and invitations." I knew what she was about to say before she said it. "You're so good at organizing these things." I leaned back against the couch. Normally, I would have opened my calendar immediately, but this time something inside me paused. "Maybe Rachel could handle it," I said. There was a small silence on the line. "Oh," my mother replied. "Well, she's pretty busy with work." "So am I." Another pause. My mother cleared her throat. "You've always been the one who keeps things running smoothly." The words were meant as a compliment, but suddenly they sounded different, less like appreciation, more like expectation. For years, I had accepted that role without questioning it. I arranged family holidays, booked restaurant reservations, coordinated birthdays, even helped manage parts of Emily's wedding that technically weren't my responsibility. I had assumed that effort meant something. that it meant I was valued. But now another thought was beginning to form. What if my usefulness had simply made it easier for everyone else to stop noticing me? That thought stayed with me for the next few days. I didn't bring up the seating with my mother. Not yet. Instead, I kept remembering small moments from the wedding weekend. Emily's quick dismissal, my parents' silence, the carefully arranged front tables filled with people who apparently mattered more in that moment. And I realized something uncomfortable. The wedding hadn't been the first time I'd felt that quiet shift in the room. It had just been the first time I couldn't ignore it anymore. Sometimes people understand family stories differently depending on where they're sitting. From the front of the room, everything probably looked perfect that night. But from the back table, the view had been very clear. 2 weeks after the wedding, Emily invited me over for dinner. Her new apartment with Daniel still smelled faintly like fresh paint and unpacked boxes. They were both in that early, newly married phase where everything felt slightly celebratory. Daniel was opening a bottle of wine in the kitchen when Emily and I sat down at the table. "I've been meaning to ask you something," I said gently. Emily glanced up. "About the wedding." She smiled cautiously. "Was something wrong?" I took a breath. "Rachel told me the seating chart was finalized before the reception." Emily looked down at her glass. "Yeah, it was." "So the change wasn't last minute?" She hesitated. Daniel set the wine bottle on the table and quietly moved back toward the kitchen, sensing the shift in the conversation. Emily sighed. "It was complicated." "How?" She rubbed her forehead. "Daniel's parents were really particular about the front tables." "Why?" "They wanted some of their business partners seated near them." "And the only way to do that was to move me?" Emily didn't answer right away. Finally, she said softly, "You're the easiest person in the family to move." The words landed gently, but they landed hard. Not cruel, just honest in a way that made everything else suddenly clearer. For a moment after Emily said it, the room was completely quiet. Daniel was moving dishes around in the kitchen, pretending to be busy with something that clearly didn't need that much attention. The sound of a cabinet closing echoed faintly through the apartment. At the table, Emily kept her eyes on the rim of her glass. "You're the easiest person in the family to move." She hadn't said it with cruelty. If anything, she sounded almost relieved to say it out loud. And strangely, that made it harder to react. Because the truth is, she wasn't entirely wrong. For most of my life, I had been the person who adjusted. If plans changed, I adjusted. If someone needed help, I adjusted. If something needed fixing, organizing, coordinating, smoothing over, I adjusted. Somewhere along the way, that flexibility had quietly turned into an assumption that I would always be the one who moved. I folded my hands on the table and looked at my sister. "So, when you finalized the seating chart," I said carefully, "you already knew I wouldn't be sitting with the family." Emily nodded once. "It wasn't meant to be a big thing." "Then why not tell me beforehand?" She hesitated. "Because I knew you'd probably say it was fine." The answer was so simple it almost made me laugh. "You didn't think it was worth mentioning?" Emily exhaled slowly. "It was just easier not to make it into a conversation." Daniel stepped back into the dining area then, carrying the wine bottle. He poured a little into each of our glasses before sitting down beside Emily. "I told her it might look strange," he said quietly. Emily shot him a look. "You said it would probably be fine." Daniel shrugged slightly. "I said it might be noticed." He glanced at me. but weddings get complicated with family seating. I nodded. That seems to be the theme. The three of us sat there for a moment. I wasn't angry in the way people expect during family arguments. There was no raised voice, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, there was a strange calm settling over me, the kind of calm that comes when something finally makes sense. I spent a lot of time helping with the wedding, I said. Emily's shoulders softened slightly. I know you did, and I'm grateful for that. But when it came to deciding who sat where, my place wasn't really part of the calculation. Emily rubbed her temples again. It wasn't about you personally. That's exactly the point, I replied. She looked up. What do you mean? It wasn't about me at all. Neither of them spoke, and in that silence, something inside me finally settled into place. For years, I had believed that the role I played in our family meant something deeper, that being reliable meant being valued, that helping meant belonging. But the truth was simpler than that. My role had been useful, and usefulness is easy to rearrange. That night at the wedding hadn't created the pattern. It had just revealed it. Emily broke the silence first. I didn't think it would hurt you this much. Her voice sounded genuinely confused. That's because it probably wouldn't have hurt you, I said gently. She frowned. What does that mean? You've never been the person who gets moved. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair but didn't interrupt. Emily stared at the table for a long moment. Then she said quietly, I guess I assumed you wouldn't mind. Exactly. We finished dinner without arguing. The conversation moved to safer topics after that: Daniel's work schedule, Emily's plans to start a small design business, an upcoming holiday trip they were considering. On the surface, the evening looked completely normal. But something inside me had already changed. I drove home through quiet streets that night, and for the first time since the wedding, my thoughts felt surprisingly clear. I wasn't replaying the reception anymore. I wasn't wondering why the seating chart had changed. Emily had answered that question. Because I was the easiest person to move. And that sentence carried more truth about my place in the family than I had been willing to admit before. The real shift came about 3 weeks later. My mother called again, this time about the anniversary dinner for Aunt Linda. We really need to get the reservations handled, she said. The restaurant fills up quickly. I listened without interrupting. And invitations should probably go out this week, she continued. You're so organized with those things. Normally, I would have opened my laptop while we talked, started making lists, checked availability. But instead, I sat at my kitchen table, looking out the window. Mom, I said calmly, I'm not going to organize the dinner. There was a long pause. Oh, she said. Not angry, just surprised. Well, I thought you usually handled these things. I used to. Another silence followed. My mother tried again. It's just that you're so good at keeping everything together. I could hear the familiar tone behind the compliment, the same tone that had guided dozens of similar conversations over the years. But this time, something inside me remained steady. I'm sure someone else can handle it. Like who? I don't know. You're the one who usually takes care of family events. I smiled slightly to myself. That's exactly the problem. She didn't respond. For a moment, I wondered if she understood what I meant. Then she said slowly, Is this about the wedding? I considered the question. Yes, I said. Another long pause. Finally, she sighed. It was just seating. I looked at the quiet street outside my window. I know. But you're still upset. No, I said calmly. I'm just paying attention now. My mother didn't say anything for several seconds. Then she changed the subject and asked about work. The conversation ended politely a few minutes later. But something important had happened during those 5 minutes. For the first time in my life, I had stepped out of the role everyone expected me to play. And I didn't step back into it afterward. At first, the family assumed it was temporary. When Aunt Linda's anniversary dinner approached and no one had made reservations, my mother called again. Are you sure you can't help just this once? I'm sure. The dinner ended up happening anyway, just smaller. A few details fell through. The restaurant booking was slightly chaotic. Someone forgot to bring the cake. Nothing disastrous, but noticeably less organized than usual. After that, similar situations started appearing. Holiday planning, birthday gatherings, small family events that once would have quietly landed on my shoulders. Each time, I stepped back. Not dramatically, not with resentment, just consistently. The first few months were awkward. My mother occasionally hinted that things felt different. Emily once joked that I had retired from family logistics. I smiled and let the comment pass. Because the truth was, I hadn't retired. I had just stopped volunteering for a job I had never formally accepted. And something interesting happened once that shift settled in. The family adjusted. Not immediately, but gradually. Rachel started organizing some gatherings. My brother handled travel planning when he visited. Emily hosted a few holidays herself. The world didn't collapse. It just rearranged itself slightly. About 6 months after the wedding, our family gathered again for Thanksgiving. This time, the dinner was at Emily and Daniel's apartment. The table was smaller than the ones I used to arrange. The schedule ran a little late. Someone forgot cranberry sauce. But the evening felt relaxed in a way family events hadn't felt in years. At one point during dinner, Emily looked around the table and laughed. I have a whole new appreciation for how much work these things actually take. Our eyes met across the table. She didn't say anything else, but the moment carried a quiet understanding. Later that night, as people were getting their coats, my mother stood beside me near the doorway. You seem different lately, she said. Different how? Calmer. I thought about that for a moment. Maybe I am. She studied me carefully. Then she nodded once. The conversation ended there. The wedding reception still crosses my mind sometimes. The bright ballroom, the front tables filled with people who seemed important in that moment, and the quiet table near the back wall where I sat watching everything unfold. At the time, it felt like a humiliation. Now it feels more like a moment of clarity. Because from that seat, I finally saw something I had missed for years. Not about my sister, not even about my family, but about the role I had been playing without realizing it. And once you see something clearly like that, you can't really go back to pretending you didn't. The funny thing is, the family still invites me to everything. Birthdays, holidays, anniversaries. I still show up. I still care about them. The difference now is simpler than it sounds. I don't move tables anymore.